Hello and welcome back to the Purposeful Shift. I'm Emma Bryant and I am really glad that you have chosen to spend some time with me today. This week is another slightly different episode because rather than researching a particular topic, I wanted to reflect on something that has been happening in my own life over the last few weeks. And actually, it follows on rather neatly from last week's episode about procrastination. Because after spending some time researching why we procrastinate and talking about how sometimes we're not avoiding the task itself, but the feelings associated with the task, I then proceeded to spend this week procrastinating. So clearly I've learned a lot. But then I think what happened this week has helped me to understand some of what I talked about last week a little bit differently. Because I've realised that procrastination of individual tasks was probably a small part of my own problem. And the bigger problem that I had is probably overwhelm. And rather ironically, I have probably been procrastinating over dealing with that overwhelm too. I have felt the overwhelm building for a few weeks now. And this is a cycle that I have been in several times before where I have reached or nearly reached burnout. And this time, I think it reached a tipping point when I went camping over the weekend and I had a few hours at the most glorious beach in the sun, and I still wasn't feeling as joyful about it as I would normally. And then I came home from camping and almost immediately I wanted to get out of the house again and to escape that reality of being at home. I looked around and there just seemed to be so much to do. There was washing, there was cleaning, and just general clutter everywhere because we just have way too much stuff. And I'd not been spending any time recently working on reducing the amount of clutter that we've got. And so it just been building on the sides, nothing had been put away. And it was just feeling like it was all consuming and kind of suffocating almost. And then Monday came and I looked at my diary and I realized that I'd managed to allocate myself more things than there were realistically hours available to do them in every single day of this week. And as usual, I had underestimated how long each of those things would take, which I'm actually very good at doing, not just in work, but in all areas of my life. So even, for example, when Google Maps tells me how long a journey is going to take, I want to challenge it or to get there sooner or to map the route again in case it was wrong. Because I think, no, surely it's not going to take that long. I have an assignment due in 2 weeks for my master's that I haven't even started. And I'm going to be away in London for part of the second week and traveling for 2 days, which meant I didn't really have even 2 weeks left to do that assignment. I had maybe 8 days at best. I even turned down a night out with my husband this week because I felt like I needed to use that time in the evening to catch up on work, to try and feel like I wasn't drowning in my tasks anymore. And whilst all of this was going on, I found myself seeking moments of joy to lift my kind of sinking mood, which meant that I wasn't necessarily using the time I did have available particularly well. So I found myself cleaning the house, something which I genuinely do not enjoy at all. I baked chocolate chip cookies for the family. We played board games as a family 2 nights in a row after dinner, which we hadn't done for weeks. And I started going through my kind of sales or junk email folders, seeing what people were sending me and then what their emails said. And then I found myself starting to watch other people's content online and convincing myself that I was learning and therefore that this was a perfectly legitimate use of my time. And because some of it was free content that was only available for a limited period, there was a conference, an ADHD conference, for example, and you could only watch the episodes for 24 hours unless you paid for kind of longer term access. So there was a very real kind of FOMO, a fear of missing out involved in that too. I had to watch it now because it was going to disappear. So I convinced myself that that took priority over something else. And of course, if I'd not looked through those email folders in the first place and read those emails, the dates would have passed, the opportunity would have passed, I would have been none the wiser. And later I would have just deleted that email and thought, oh, well, I missed that, never mind. And life would be just the same and you carry on and, it wouldn't have been that important. So meanwhile, the things that I was feeling overwhelmed about, they were still there. The assignment deadline was there. The business handover that's coming up was there. The client work that has to be done was still there. And I also found I was sitting at my computer for longer, but working much more slowly than I usually would. I felt like tasks were taking longer. I couldn't seem to think as clearly. And I was getting frustrated with myself about that as well. And I think that was probably the point when I realized that something really wasn't working and I needed to do something about this, which didn't involve giving up and just going back to bed and pretending it wasn't all happening. So I started thinking back to what I talked about in last week's episode about procrastination. And the research that I'd explored suggested that procrastination isn't necessarily a time management problem, but it can be an emotional regulation problem. So sometimes we're not avoiding the task, we're avoiding the feeling that is actually attached to the task. And when I thought about my behavior this week through that lens, I started wondering what I was actually avoiding, because there was nothing that was particularly challenging or uncomfortable in my diary or on my to-do list this week. It was all pretty normal stuff, apart from a few bigger decisions and final actions that were relating to the handover of my franchise business. So I didn't think that I was avoiding one particular piece of work or one particular task as such, but that there were just too many things competing for my attention, and I just felt absolutely frazzled. And I think perhaps the thing that I was really avoiding, and the thing that I was procrastinating on, was accepting that I couldn't do all of them, that feeling that I couldn't get everything that I needed to get done. So something had to give, and it was the feelings that were attached to something having to give. And I also didn't know what that thing should be. And I didn't particularly want anything to give because I wanted to do all of it. I wanted to feel like I was succeeding rather than failing, or I felt like I needed to do it all. And everything to me seemed to have an equal weighting of importance. I couldn't see how to prioritize or to organize or to remove anything from my diary. It was like I was in the forest and I couldn't see the wood for the trees. So I'm sure I've said this before, I tend to have lots of ideas. I get excited by new things often and I want to act on them. When something catches my attention, my instinct isn't generally to think, oh, that's a lovely idea for next year or next month or even next week. I want to do it now. So I think I've spent several weeks or maybe months trying to work out how I could fit everything in that I wanted to do, rather than asking the much more sensible question of whether everything needed to fit in at all. And if it did all need to fit in, how much importance did each thing carry? What was the right order or sequence to do those things so that they could be completed one at a time? So I tried on Monday to just carry on, to get on with everything that needed to be done. And I did the same on Tuesday, but the pressure was starting to show on Tuesday. And by Wednesday, I knew that I needed to get everything out of my head. I'd started doing an energy audit for myself this week, 3 times a day throughout the week, which highlighted some of the things that were weighing on me, things that were feeling like they were draining my energy, and identifying the things that were charging me too. So one of those things that was weighing on me that felt like it was draining me was that I had too much going on in my head. I describe my thoughts like a pinball machine, and all of the balls are ideas or tasks, and there's just too many of them bouncing around and not enough space for them. So they keep banging into each other all the time, and then very few ever make it off the table and down into wherever pinballs go when they need to rest. So I had to try and clear some of these pinballs in my head. I needed to brain dump everything. And then I needed to sort and prioritize and sequence to give myself the clarity that I needed to be more effective day to day. I also felt like I needed a sounding board because I was going around in circles with my own thoughts when I was trying to work this out on my own. And this is exactly where I would normally turn to a coach, or a coach would come in, somebody to share these things with to help make sense of exactly this situation or something similar. But I'm between coaches right now. So I used ChatGPT to help me as a sounding board for this particular task. Now, I know a lot of people are anti-AI, or for very good reasons, and I'm not here to try and agitate you or advocate either way. I do use AI in my business, and I'm quite comfortable with using it for this process, but I know many people wouldn't be. And of course, you don't need to use AI, and you don't need a coach to do this. A friend or a partner could help, or maybe you could do it on your own. But I just felt like I needed something or someone to try and work through this process with me. So I used AI on Wednesday and I did a massive brain dump. I tried to think of everything that was taking up space. And I think most of what was there in my head, all those pinballs, they came out. Work, podcasting, study, business ideas, a YouTube channel, the franchise ending, my daughter starting college, things that I'd said I wanted to do, things that I'd convinced myself that I should do. And then I started going through all of those things and making decisions. And it was quite the shift for me to go from asking, how am I going to get all of this done, to what actually needs my attention now. So some of the things stayed exactly where they were. They kept their place in my diary. They were time bound, their commitments, their deadlines, it's client work. Things like the assignment obviously had to stay. But some things moved. And some things that I'd put into my calendar didn't actually need to be appointments in my calendar at all. So they moved into Google Tasks, or I set them as reminders instead. Some things were postponed until after my assignment hand in, given that that's an urgent deadline that I now have and requires a lot of time that I hadn't allocated in my diary. And some things have moved all the way into next year, into 2027, which sounds so far away. And for me, I found that moving things into next year was the most difficult part of all. Because for me, postponing an idea can feel a little bit like giving up on it, especially when it's something that I'm excited about. Because maybe I feel like I'll forget, or I won't have the same thoughts around that idea, or I'll miss the boat and somebody else will do that thing before I have a chance to do that thing or bring it to market. But I had to tell myself that I wasn't saying no to those things altogether. I was just saying, no, not now. And all of those fears, yes, they're legitimate. They're not things that we shouldn't fear or worry about, but they are concerns in relation to what's going on right now. And it made sense to sequence them in that particular order. And by doing so, it meant that those things weren't being taken away from me. I wasn't deciding that they were bad ideas or that I was never going to do them. I was simply deciding that they didn't need my attention now, not just yet. And to be honest, that actually felt like quite a relief. Once I'd accepted that those things weren't being taken away, I felt the weight lifting. And my logical self tells me that when those things do get their turn next year, they might not even be as important to me then as they are now. And if they are still as important then that's actually a really good sign that I'm not wasting my time on something that would have been a short-lived dopamine hit that would have been soon replaced by the next shiny thing to come along. So I ended up with a fairly simple rule for the next few weeks, and I put it on a post-it note on my desk as a reminder. I tried to stick it to my monitor actually, but it fell off, which was a bit frustrating. And that is, nothing new goes into my diary unless something else comes out first. And I think that rule will help me to protect the space that I have now deliberately created in my diary for each day, for each week. And every time something potentially needs to go into the diary, I'm going to look at that rule, and then I'm going to look at that thing, that task, that activity, that appointment, whatever it might be, through one of three lenses. The first is, does this genuinely need to be protected time in my calendar? Or secondly, is it actually a task or reminder rather than something that needs a space in the diary? And thirdly, can it be removed or postponed instead? Now, I know that's not a revolutionary new productivity system, and it might seem just like common sense to you, but for me, that was quite a difficult thing to do. To get enough distance to be able to put those rules into place and to actually use them for everything that's going to come across my desk over the next couple of weeks. And I'm certainly not suggesting that I have suddenly mastered my own diary, but it has helped me. I started physically removing things from my calendar and seeing white space appear. And whilst I do kind of miss all of the rainbow colours that I did have in my diary every single day, it was a very pretty calendar to look at, this digital calendar on Google, I certainly don't feel as overwhelmed by that rainbow of colour blocks. I've also changed some of the colours so that different types of appointment and work were easier for me to see. And that was more in line with the energy audit that I'd undertaken and how I realised that certain things would charge me or drain me. And gradually, as I started removing those items and changing what were time blocks into tasks instead, I felt like I could think again. I started to feel the clarity that I knew I needed to bring to my day, to my week, to my month. Obviously, the amount of time available to me in a single day hasn't changed. We've all got the same amount of time every day. But I'd simply allowed myself to stop expecting me to fit quite so much into every day and to give myself the space so it felt like I wasn't overwhelmed every morning when I opened my computer and saw what the day brought or what the day had in store. So there's something else that I've been thinking about as a result of all of this, and a conversation that I also had with a health professional on Tuesday. I have always been somebody who does a lot. So I work quickly. I tend to balance lots of things at once. I'm deadline driven. I have high expectations of myself, and I like to exceed other people's expectations too. I've always been running a small business, sometimes alongside employment, sometimes multiple businesses. And for much of my life, that way of working has served me quite well. So I think there's probably a considerable chunk of my identity that's wrapped up in being somebody who can manage a lot and get a lot of things done, which means that reducing what I'm doing each week and how busy my calendar looks doesn't come very easily or naturally to me. I either see the white space and I want to fill it with something else, or there's a little part of my brain that interprets needing white space as a sign that I'm not coping. I've also been reflecting recently on how long I've carried those kind of expectations of myself. And when I look back to my childhood, I can see that I've probably had really high expectations for as long as I can remember. And even if I just take swimming as an example, every weekend there was a competition which required 2 days of races on both Saturday and Sunday. It required us to travel around the country, for my mum to give up 2 days of her life to sit on a poolside and watch me compete. The costs of hotels, the pressures to make national qualifying times, to PB with each swim, let alone to actually win and come home with trophies and medals. And I've carried around many of those kind of unsaid pressures and expectations into my adult life without necessarily stopping to question whether they're still reasonable for me, for who I am now, for what my life looks like, and for what I now hope to achieve. And of course, that impacts my version of success. And then I can feel disappointed in myself when I haven't achieved as much as I thought I would have by now, or this week, or today, or in an assignment grade. And that's something that I am still thinking about and working through, rather than something that I have a nice little neat conclusion for to tell you about today. But perhaps there's something worth noticing in the fact that just being capable of carrying a lot doesn't necessarily mean that I need to keep proving that I can, because who do I need to prove that to? And when I look at the work-life balance that I think I'm dreaming of, in that instance, choosing to do less is not evidence that I'm failing to cope. It's actually the opposite. It's a sign of success. And for now, maybe it's just a sensible response to the reality of the amount of time and energy that I actually have available. So I was thinking about versions of success and people who I admire. And something that we often hear about successful people, CEOs, female entrepreneurs, etc., is that they're very good at delegating. They don't spend their time doing things that somebody else could do better. They protect their time and their attention for the things that genuinely need them to do the task. The slight problem with that advice when you are self-employed or a solopreneur is that there isn't necessarily a team of people waiting for you to delegate everything to. I don't have somebody that I can hand my diary to manage my appointments, or a VA who can manage my social media or edit these podcast episodes. So for myself and anyone else in a similar situation, maybe there is another way that we can look at this, another question we can ask. So maybe rather than asking who else could do this task, maybe we come back to that earlier question. Does this actually need doing right now? Removing and postponing things this week gave me some of the same sense of relief that I think I would have got from delegating tasks to somebody else. I was no longer trying to make every task fit into my day or my week. I was choosing which things actually deserved my attention and which didn't. And I was choosing which things were, quite frankly, less important. such as growing an Instagram following, which has been taking up way more of my time each week than I would like to care to admit. So thinking back to last week's episode, clearly there's a difference between procrastinating and deliberately deciding to do something later. If I know I'm not doing something today because I have consciously decided that I'm going to do it on a Thursday or next week, that's different from me spending every day thinking, I really need to get to that, or I really should do that. One is sequencing, choosing, delegating a space and time for that particular task. The other leaves the task sitting in the background of our minds, waiting its turn and behaving a bit like the child in the backseat of a car on a long journey who is constantly asking, are we there yet? This week, I've applied that on what feels like a much bigger scale. Some things aren't happening tomorrow anymore. Some things aren't even happening next month anymore. Some aren't even happening until next year. But because I've made that decision, I now don't need to keep making it every day. I don't need those thoughts floating around in my mind or the balls crashing together in my brain trying to find their space and trying to find their score. I can create some space for the pinballs to move around. And that's a huge relief for me. So I don't have a big lesson to give you at the end of this episode today because I'm still in the lesson. I'm living it right now. I am still tired. I've still got plenty to do. I've still got an assignment due in a week and a half that isn't going to write itself. And I'm fairly certain that I'll have another exciting idea very soon that will immediately want to squeeze into my diary. But I'm trying to notice what happens before I automatically say yes to that. I'm trying to exercise some more self-control and to use some basic rules to help me make decisions that will benefit me rather than me jumping straight in, both feet first, absolutely full of excitement and can't wait to get started, because that's where I've been and it's not serving me the way I need it to. So if you've been feeling overwhelmed too, perhaps there are a couple of questions from my week this week that might be useful for you to reflect on. The first is, what are you carrying around in your head that doesn't actually need your attention right now? And the second is, what could you consciously choose to postpone rather than allowing yourself to feel guilty that you haven't done it yet? Thank you for spending some time with me today and listening to another of these slightly more reflective episodes of the Purposeful Shift. I'm still experimenting with this format, so if you enjoy these more personal episodes alongside the kind of more research ones and guest conversations, I would genuinely love to know. And if you would like to continue the conversation, you can join the Purposeful Shift newsletter, where I share reflections from the podcast, things that I'm thinking about, and prompts that you can use in your own life. You can find the link to sign up in the show notes. Thank you again for sharing a part of your day with me today. Until next time, please take care of yourself and I will see you soon.